"Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." The words, spoken no louder than a murmur, landed with the force of a physical blow. They did not echo. They absorbed all sound, all light, all air from the opulent private dining room of the Apex Hotel. They shattered the quiet elegance, like a fault line cracking across a marble floor, slicing through the delicate clinking of silver on porcelain, the soft hum of a string quartet in the corner, and the muted, billion-dollar whispers of the city's power players. For a frozen second, every fork hovered, every conversation died, every eye in the room, discreetly or not, turned towards the source of the rupture. Could you do me a favor? Grab your phone, give this video a like, drop a comment down below, and hit that subscribe button. It means the world to keep sharing stories like this. Stories that remind us we're not alone. All right, let's keep going. Every phone, held just below the table, tilted into record mode. Gideon Croft, the billionaire CEO of Zenith Dynamics, did not flinch. He merely adjusted his diamond cufflinks, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if swatting away an insect. A few drops of the spilled Bordeaux stained the cuff of his tailored jacket, a dark blemish on the pristine white. That was the offense in his eyes. The human being before him was merely the clumsy instrument of that offense. Arrogance stood motionless. In one hand, she held a folded linen cloth, her knuckles white. In the other, a bottle of still water, its crystal clarity, a stark contrast to the dark red stain spreading across the tablecloth. She did not speak. She did not cry. She did not apologize for the second time, because the first had been so thoroughly rejected. She did not need to. Her stillness was an answer more profound than any shout. What Gideon Croft did not know, what he couldn't possibly have known in the towering arrogance of his self-made universe, was that Alara was not just a waitress working a high-stakes investor dinner. She was not just another face in the legion of service staff he trained himself to ignore. She was a scholar of this very world, an observer hiding in plain sight, an Olympic-level track athlete who had traded her running spikes for serving trays not out of necessity, but out of choice. She was there to learn, to watch, to understand the mechanics of power from the ground up. Gideon hadn't just insulted a black woman. He had insulted the most important person in the room. And he had done it with a gallery of silent witnesses and the future of his $3.5 billion acquisition deal hanging by the gossamer thread of one man's judgment. Across the table, Julian Sterling, the legendary investor Gideon, was so desperate to impress, slowly, deliberately set down his silver fork. The sound was infinitesimally small, yet it resonated like a judge's gavel. He did not speak. He did not blink. His gaze, calm and unreadable moments before, shifted to Gideon Croft with the immense, silent weight of a coming storm. The room held its breath, waiting for the thunder. But the storm would not be loud. It would be a quiet, devastating shift in the atmosphere. And by the time Gideon realized the ground beneath his feet had vanished, he would already be in freefall. Power, Gideon Croft believed, was a simple equation. It was the product of fear and leverage. In his world, a world he had built from nothing with his bare hands and a ruthless intellect, people were either assets or liabilities, tools to be sharpened or obstacles to be removed. He had clawed his way from a cramped apartment in a forgotten borough to the glass and steel penthouse of Zenith Dynamics. And he hadn't done it by being kind. He had done it by being feared. Inside his mind, as he stared past Alara's still form, his thoughts were not of regret, but of justification, an interruption, a distraction. This dinner was the culmination of a decade of relentless work. Julian Sterling's capital was the final piece of the puzzle, the key that would elevate him from a mere billionaire to a titan, a legend. A clumsy waitress was a variable he had not accounted for, and he had dealt with it as he dealt with all inconvenient variables, swiftly and with finality. He remembered firing a senior engineer not for a mistake, but for hesitating in a meeting. Hesitation, to Gideon, was the rust that corroded the machinery of progress. Empathy was a luxury he had never been able to afford. He saw her not as a person, but as a momentary glitch in the most important presentation of his life. Miles away from Gideon's cold calculus, yet in the same room, Alara Vance's foundation was built of something else entirely. Her stillness was not born of shock, but of profound, weary practice. It was the resilience forged in hospital waiting rooms, watching her mother fade from the vibrant woman who taught her to read into a whisper of a memory. It was the strength she found the day after the funeral, when at 18, she became the sole guardian of her 10-year-old brother, Leo, whose world was defined by cerebral palsy and a smile that could outshine the Sunday. Her mind flashed to him for a second, Leo, in his wheelchair, cheering her on from the sidelines of a high school track meet. The dream of the Olympics, of gold medals and endorsements, had once been so real she could taste the metallic tang of victory. But dreams didn't pay for physical therapy or the rent on their small apartment. So she had walked away from the podium and into the workforce, taking on 3 jobs, running not towards a finish line, but towards the end of each month. This job at the apex wasn't a sign of desperation, it was a dissertation. After Julian Sterling, her mother's oldest friend, and the man who had adopted her in all but name after her mother's passing, offered her a cushy position at his firm, she had respectfully declined. "I need to understand the world you operate in, Julian," she had told him. "Not from a boardroom, but from the basement. I need to see how the powerful behave when they think no one important is watching." Julian, whose own wisdom was built on observation, had understood. So she watched, she listened, she learned that true power often whispered, while insecurity shouted. And tonight, Gideon Croft was shouting. And then there was Julian Sterling. His past was etched into the lines around his calm, observant eyes. He had grown up in the rubble of post-war Berlin, raised by a mother who had survived the unthinkable. She had taught him that silence was a language all its own, a tool for listening, not a sign of weakness. "Junge," she used to say in her soft German accent, "to know a man's true character, do not listen to his words to you. Watch his hands and his tongue when he deals with those he believes are beneath him." For 20 years, he had been a quiet father figure to Alara, marveling at the steel spine she inherited from her mother. He had wanted to shield her from the world's harshness, but he knew her spirit demanded to face it head-on. He had agreed to her field study, trusting her judgment. Tonight, watching Gideon Croft dismiss his daughter with such casual cruelty, he felt no rage. Rage was a hot, messy emotion. What he felt was a cold, clear certainty, confirmation. Charles had just shown his truth, and unfortunately for him, someone profoundly important was watching. The moment had been born from the mundane. Alara approached table 1, where the fate of Zenith Dynamics was being decided, with a bottle of Chateau Margaux. Her movements were a study in practiced grace, honed over hundreds of nights, serving men who never saw her face. She knew the rhythm of these events, which guests preferred their water refilled after every 3rd sip, which ones made fleeting eye contact, and which, like Gideon Croft, looked straight through her, as if she were made of glass. She leaned in, her hand steady, to pour for one of Gideon's junior executives, and that's when it happened. A slight, almost imperceptible jostle from another server passing behind her. The neck of the bottle tipped. It wasn't a crash or a shatter. It was a slow, deliberate-seeming spill, as if guided by a malevolent fate. The deep red Bordeaux bled across the pristine white tablecloth, a creeping stain crawling inexorably toward the cuff of Gideon Croft's $1,000 suit jacket. A few drops landed on his custom monogrammed sleeve. "I am so terribly sorry, sir," Alara said instantly, her voice soft but clear, already reaching with a fresh napkin. It was reflex, the ingrained response of years in service. Her only thought was to mitigate the damage, to smooth over the disruption. But Gideon Croft didn't see service. He saw an assault on his perfect evening, a stain on his authority. He didn't speak like a man addressing a mistake. He spoke like a king addressing a peasant who had dared to track mud onto his marble throne. "Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." The words were surgical, not shouted for the room to hear, but hissed with a focused, personal venom designed to cut through dignity and leave a festering wound. The quartet in the corner let a final, mournful note hang in the air, then fell silent. Conversations at the surrounding tables, already muted, ceased entirely. A junior executive at Gideon's own table let out a choked, nervous laugh, a desperate attempt to pretend the moment wasn't radioactive. Alara stood, her hand frozen mid-air with the napkin. She had heard things before, the whispered jokes, the offhand comments, the casual dismissals from people who saw her uniform, not her humanity. But this was different. This wasn't a whisper. It was a declaration, made in the heart of the Colosseum, under the watchful eyes of the Emperor himself. She lowered her hand and took a half step back. Her silence was a shield. Across the table, Julian Sterling's gaze shifted from Alara to Gideon. It was a gaze that held no judgment, only a deep, profound clarity, as if he were looking at a specimen under a microscope and had finally identified its species. He saw the rot at the core of the man who wanted $3.5 billion of his trust. Gideon, oblivious, reached for a new napkin and dabbed at his sleeve, his face a mask of irritation. He had already dismissed her, already moved on. The incident, in his mind, was over. But for everyone else at the table, it had just begun. The real stain wasn't the wine on his cuff. It was the ugliness he had just revealed, a stain that no amount of money or power could ever wash away. The meal continued, but the appetite was gone. Courses arrived, seared scallops, roasted duck plated like works of art, but they might as well have been ashes. The air at table 1 was thick with unspoken words, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Gideon Croft, however, seemed determined to power through it. He laughed louder than necessary, spoke faster, his words sharp and aggressive, as he tried to recapture the room's attention and steer the conversation back to his pitch. "You know what separates winners from whiners, Julian?" he declared, his voice slicing through the tension. "Winners focus, they dominate. They don't let minor distractions get in the way of the goal." His executives nodded in frantic agreement. Julian Sterling didn't nod. He simply picked up his water glass, took a single, measured sip, and set it back down, his eyes never leaving Gideon's face. The silence of his response was more damning than any rebuke. Alara returned to the table. Her poise was an act of quiet rebellion. She moved with the same unhurried precision as before, a silent testament that she would not be diminished. She refilled Julian's glass, then his assistant's, then the other investors. She served Gideon last. The small, subtle shift in protocol did not go unnoticed. Gideon's jaw tightened. As she moved to his end of the table to pour his water, he decided the moment required a reassertion of dominance. It wasn't enough to have insulted her. He needed to ensure she understood her place. As she tilted the crystal pitcher, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. The grip wasn't hard enough to bruise, but it was firm, cold, and utterly controlling. It was a gesture of ownership, a physical manifestation of his contempt. The room didn't gasp this time. They watched. "You wait until I have finished speaking," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper, his breath thick with the scent of expensive wine. "When real business is happening, the help stands still. You do not interrupt." His grip lingered for a moment too long, a branding of his authority. In that instant, Alara looked directly into his eyes. There was no fear there, no anger, only a calm, unbreakable clarity, as if she were seeing not a powerful CEO, but a small, frightened man terrified of losing control. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice even and neutral. "I understand completely." Then, gently, without a struggle, she pulled her wrist from his grasp. It was a movement of pure, unforced will. She stepped back, her dignity a shimmering, invisible shield around her. Gideon blinked, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to flinch, to cower. Her composure unnerved him far more than any outburst would have. Across the table, Julian Sterling placed his silverware down for the final time. He leaned towards his longtime assistant, who had been watching the exchange with a stony expression. Julian said just 2 words in German, his voice barely audible but utterly final. "Es ist Zeit." It is time. The assistant nodded once, stood, and disappeared through a side door. The verdict had been delivered. Gideon Croft, still trying to sell his vision of the future, had no idea that his own future had just been irrevocably canceled. The second offense was not a mistake, it was a signature, and it had just signed his professional death warrant. Gideon was in the middle of a sentence about market synergy when Julian Sterling rose from his seat. He didn't stand up quickly. He rose slowly, quietly, with the deliberate weight of a man about to change the course of history, even if it was just the history of one company on one night. His movement was a command. The entire table fell silent. The rest of the room, sensing the shift in gravity, followed suit. Conversations faded. Silverware paused mid-air. Even the staff along the wall seemed to freeze, sensing that an irreversible moment was about to unfold. Julian first looked at Alara, who stood poised near a service station. Her eyes met his across the sea of stunned faces. There was a lifetime of understanding in that shared glance, a nod of acknowledgement, of respect, and perhaps of permission. Then he turned back to the table, his gaze settling upon the confused face of Gideon Croft. "Mr. Croft," Julian began, his voice calm, almost gentle, which made it all the more chilling. "Before we continue discussing numbers, there is someone very important here I would like you to meet properly." Gideon's brow furrowed in confusion, but he managed a forced, ingratiating smile. "Of course, Julian. One of your VPs? Your general counsel, perhaps?" Julian ignored the question. He raised one hand, not in a grand gesture, but a simple invitation, beckoning towards the back of the room. From the shadows, Alara Vance stepped forward. She had removed her server's apron. She held no tray. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to hide and everything to reveal. She did not stop behind Julian, as an assistant might. She stopped beside him, an equal. The room was so quiet one could hear the flicker of the candle flames. Julian rested a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of profound fatherly pride. "This," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power that filled every corner of the room, "is Alara Vance. My daughter." The air didn't just crack, it shattered. A collective, silent gasp rippled through the guests. Gideon Croft blinked once, then again, his mind refusing to process the information. His lips parted, but no words came out. The confident smirk he had worn all night dissolved, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed horror. "She was adopted when she was 7, Julian continued, his voice steady, his gaze sweeping across the room, implicating every person present as a witness. "She chose to keep her birth name, but make no mistake. She is my daughter, and I am every bit her father." He turned his focus back to the shell-shocked man at his table. "Alara has been working here not because she needed the income, but because she wanted to understand firsthand how people in power treat those they believe are beneath them. She wanted to see character when the cameras are off and the titles don't matter." Julian paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Tonight, all of you have witnessed exactly that." Phones, which had been recording covertly, were now held up openly. The silence was thick with realization. This was no longer a private dinner. It was a public execution. Julian looked at Gideon Croft one last time, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a deep, sorrowful finality. "The girl you called stupid is the woman I raised to be wiser, more resilient, and more courageous than most CEOs I have ever met. The deal, Mr. Croft, is off." In that moment, it wasn't just a $3.5 billion deal that died. It was an empire. It was a reputation. It was the carefully constructed world of Gideon Croft, brought crashing down not by a market downturn or a failed product, but by 2 ugly, thoughtless sentences spoken to the wrong person at the wrong time. The sound of a single chair scraping back against the polished floor shouldn't feel like an earthquake, but tonight it did. One of Julian's fellow investors, a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, stood up, folded his napkin, placed it on the table, and walked out without a word. Then another, and another. It was a silent, undeniable exodus. The herd, which Gideon had prided himself on leading, was now stampeding away from him. Gideon Croft remained standing, frozen, a statue of disbelief. His empire had just lost its foundation, and he was still looking for the blueprints. His phone began to vibrate on the table, a frantic, buzzing tremor. Then another phone, and another. Notifications lit up screens across the room. Julian's assistant returned, leaning in to whisper something in his ear. Julian nodded once. That was all it took. Less than 15 minutes later, the first digital shockwaves hit. Headlines began appearing on the screens of the departing guests. Sterling pulls out of 3.5B Zenith deal after public incident at the Apex. Tikteo Gideon Croft in hot water over alla get racist, abusive comments. The waitress was his daughter, inside the deal, killing dinner that just cost Zenith Dynamics billions. By the time the untouched dessert courses were being cleared away, Zenith Dynamics stock, traded on after-hours markets, had begun to hemorrhage value. It dropped 17% in less than an hour, then 22%. Panic was a virus, and the video clip of Gideon's insult, now circulating among a private network of investors and journalists, was the superspreader. The calls flooding Gideon's phone were no longer from his fawning executives. They were from furious board members, panicked legal advisors, and desperate PR reps. Investors were demanding statements. Partners were demanding explanations. The machinery he had so carefully controlled was now turning against him, its gears grinding him into irrelevance. There was no spin that could bury this. The truth was too raw, too public, too damningly simple. The viral moment took on a life of its own. Shared, clipped, memed, screenshots of his sneering face became symbols of corporate arrogance. The Apex incident began trending worldwide. Within hours, major corporate sponsors of Zenith Dynamics' annual tech conference began issuing statements of deep concern before quietly pulling their funding. Strategic partners announced they were re-evaluating their relationship with the company. The true collapse, however, came from within. The company culture Gideon had fostered, one built on fear and intimidation, had no loyalty to defend him. Top-tier engineers and executives, who had long chafed under his tyrannical rule, saw their opening. Resignations began to pour in, not in a trickle, but in a flood. The talent that made Zenith Dynamics a powerhouse was abandoning the sinking ship. At 11:47 p.m., the emergency board of directors voted unanimously to suspend him indefinitely, effective immediately. At 12:14 a.m., as he sat alone in his cavernous office overlooking the city lights, his access to company servers, email, and security credentials was revoked. He was locked out of his own kingdom. By sunrise, Zenith Dynamics wasn't a tech giant anymore. It was a cautionary tale, a headline in the business section under a single, brutal word: fallout. Arrogance had a price, and tonight, the bill had come due. It was $5 billion, plus interest, compounded by the total and absolute collapse of everything he thought he controlled. The sun had not yet cleared the skyline when Alara Vance stepped into the gleaming lobby of Sterling Holdings headquarters. She was no longer in a server's uniform. There was no tray in her hand, no badge that read service staff. She wore a tailored navy blue blazer with soft shoulders and flat shoes that meant business, not burden. She was not just walking into a new building. She was walking into the next chapter of her life, a chapter she had written for herself through resilience and quiet resolve. Waiting for her on the 40th floor, in the executive wing, was a new office with a view of the entire city. On the polished mahogany desk sat a simple, sleek nameplate. It read, Alara Vance, Director of Corporate Humanity. The title was not decorative. It was not a symbolic gesture meant to smooth over headlines or placate investors. It was a real, fully funded position created at Julian Sterling's insistence, endowed with full decision-making authority. It was a role given to a woman who had seen the best and worst of leadership from the ground floor up, who understood that a company's most valuable asset wasn't its intellectual property, but its people. She sat at her desk for the first time, taking a steadying breath, letting the reality of the last 12 hours settle in. The chaos, the collapse, but also her choice, her voice, her place not given but earned. Later that afternoon, she stood before a company-wide live stream. Employees from San Francisco to Singapore tuned in. Some had only seen her face in viral clips, a silent figure in a server's uniform. Others who had worked events alongside her now looked on in stunned recognition. Now, they would all hear her voice. She stepped to the microphone, calm and centered. Yesterday, she began, her voice even and clear, I was called stupid. Not because I made a mistake, but because someone in a position of power believed his title made him more human than me. She paused, letting the silence hold the weight of the statement. I said nothing in that moment, but today, I choose to speak. The virtual and physical rooms were utterly silent. There is a difference between power and leadership, she continued. Power is taken, leadership is earned. I didn't take this seat, I was trusted with it. And I intend to honor that trust by building a company where people are valued not just for what they produce, but for who they are. I believe every role deserves dignity, every title deserves accountability, and every voice, especially the quiet ones, deserves to be heard. A wave of applause filled the room. It was not polite, corporate applause. It was real, heartfelt, and resonant. In Alara, they didn't just see a new leader. They saw a mirror, and for the first time in a long time, a future they wanted to be a part of. What happened that night at the Apex wasn't just about one CEO and one woman he underestimated. It was a story about all of us. It was about how we treat people when we think no one is watching, how easy it is to value resumes over respect and power over people. But someone is always watching, not always with a camera. Sometimes it's a child at the next table, a colleague on the edge of the room, or the very person you think has no voice, no name, no consequence. Gideon Croft didn't lose a deal because of numbers or strategy. He lost it because he failed the simplest, most fundamental test of character, treating another human being with basic dignity. It's a test we all face every day at the drive-thru, in a tense meeting, on the phone with a customer service agent. Those are the moments that truly define us. Alara reminded the world of something we too often forget, that strength can be quiet, that dignity isn't given but lived, and that real leadership isn't about who talks the loudest, but about who listens the most. So, perhaps the next time we feel the urge to dismiss someone, to look past them, to say something small but cutting, we should pause. And we should ask ourselves one question. If that person turned out to be the one holding the pen that would sign our future, would we be proud of how we treated them? Because sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is not the one at the head of the table. Sometimes, they are the one clearing it.